This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You will get exclusive subscriber-only content. For example, most recently, an interview with Itai Ater, professor of economics at the Tel Aviv University, who discusses his new study into the radically new patterns of emigration of Israelis out of Israel in the last few years. Or an interview with Sina Azodi, professor of Middle East politics at George Washington University, about his new book, Iran and the Bomb. Just go to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and look for the big button that says Patreon, click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a filmmaker and film scholar. He's the head of film and television at the School of Communication at Ariel University in the West Bank settlement of Ariel. He is the author of a new book, The Jew in Dutch Cinema, Images, Stereotypes and National Identity, that has just been published by Routledge. Dr. Eyal Boers, hello and welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, thank you.
So, the Jew in Dutch cinema, how prevalent is the figure of the Jew in the Dutch cultural imagination at large to even merit this as a topic of investigation?
Excellent question. I think what merits the research is the fact that I found that the first substantial feature film in Dutch history was not only produced by Jews, but it has a clear Jewish story about a Jewish woman who is thrown out of her house for having a relationship with a Gentile doctor, and in the end she reunites with her family. So
that's a silent film, right?
It's a silent film from 1914 called in Dutch Weergevonden, which means lost and found. And the very fact that the first substantial feature film in Dutch history deals with that made me think and justify a research. I found 25 feature films which feature a Jewish story or Jewish characters. There are many more, especially documentaries, but that was enough to justify a research. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How do you explain it, that the first feature film in Dutch cinematic history featured that story?
A number of explanations. The first explanation would be that most of the cinema-going audience was, as in other countries, in the big cities, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, and Jews were concentrated in those cities, especially Amsterdam. The large part of the Jewish community in the Netherlands was always in Amsterdam, so a large part of the cinema-going audience is Jewish. So producers and entrepreneurs catered to the Jewish taste, in a sense. That's one explanation. You've got a substantial Jewish community in the Netherlands and in Amsterdam before the Holocaust in 1914. Number two, and this is more important, and this you have almost in every Western country, especially Hollywood, the Jews, cinema was the high-tech. It was the startup of the beginning of the 20th century. It was not closed fast enough for Jews. Jews could go into that industry quite easily. Hollywood was invented by Jews. That's a fact. In the same way, that kind of industry was open for Jews. Cinema. Many of them worked in theater. Many of them worked in the entertainment business. It wasn't a closed area for them. It was an opportunity, a new field they could make money in and develop in. So you have many Jewish entrepreneurs who established cinemas, and you have Jewish producers, Jewish directors, Jewish actors, as well as Jewish filmmakers who travel between America and Netherlands and bring the latest inventions, the latest developments. Sound film was brought by Jews from Hollywood to the Netherlands. So I think those two explanations
But do you see that in the Dutch culture more broadly at the time? Because, even though Jews did work in the film industry, they had to cater to the broad tastes of the general public. And, it had to strike, the stories had to strike a chord somehow in order to be effective, in order to sell tickets. Do you see, like, when you went through contemporary newspapers at the time, did similar stories about, like, Jewish life or Jewish themes feature in other cultural outlets?
Definitely. You've got a very rich theater culture that deals with Jewish stories. A lot of Dutch writers, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who write about Jewish stories. You're right. What you're saying about entrepreneurs and filmmakers, they don't necessarily cater to Jewish taste. In fact, in Hollywood and in the Netherlands, they would sometimes try to take a distance from the Jewish topics so as not to be associated with this tribal, attitude. However, the Netherlands has a very, very special connection to the Jewish community. I mean, the Jewish community in Amsterdam for hundreds of years was a very influential community, and it was a really integral part of every aspect of the city, financially, politically. They're a really, really strong and important part of the general public. So it's not very uncommon to be interested in Jewish stories, in Jewish culture, in anything that has to do with Judaism. And by the way, it continues till this day in the Netherlands. But back then, you've got approximately 140,000 Jews in a country with about 5-6 million people. That's substantial. And
also occupying very powerful positions, as you said, within politics, the economy.
Very famous writers, very famous influential people. I mean, you've got the philosopher Spinoza, and you've got many writers, theater. I mean, really, they're all around. So it's not a surprise.
What can you tell us really about the specificities of the relationship of the Netherlands with its Jewish community, as opposed to other countries in the world, chiefly in Western Europe? We all know about this ambivalence of European societies in the early 20th century, whether it's of the Weimar Republic in Germany or the French Republic, even England to an extent, and the United States. This ambivalence, on the one hand, they are liberal and therefore accepting the Jews into the midst. On the other hand, there's long traditions of hostility that still remain and prevail.
You've got continuous settlement of Jews in the Netherlands from the end of the 16th century with two main communities, the Ashkenazi community and the Portuguese Sephardic community. And I'm mentioning that because the Sephardic Portuguese community is very special. I mean, the whole beginning of this story is special. It has to do with tolerance. Most Jews escaped to the Netherlands. It was like the
promised land.
It's sort of not only is it the promised land. Amsterdam was called Jerusalem of the West for hundreds of years. Amsterdam has to this day a second name, which is Mokum, which is place in Hebrew. There are approximately between 50 and 100 words from Hebrew.
Mokum, by the way, it's not just among the Jews, right? It's the way that Dutch people call Amsterdam.
In fact, Amsterdam is called Mokum, and they have the rest of the areas in the Netherlands where Jews live are called Medina. And these are words you can say to a Dutch herring, in a Dutch herring shop, to a Gentile, and he will understand you. On top of that, you've got approximately 50 to 100 Hebrew Yiddish words in the Dutch language, which even Muslim immigrants say today, things like mazel and meshuga. All right? Really, this just to give you a little glimpse into how much Jewish culture has penetrated Dutch culture. So on the one hand, it's a haven, a tolerant haven, at least in its stereotype, for hundreds of years. So it's a special Jewish community where Jews really, really saw an opportunity to develop financially and become part of life. There was always anti-Semitism, and there were always fields in some cities where Jews could not progress. But compared to countries, you asked me compared to other countries, I mean, Jews flourished in the Netherlands. They became really part of every sector. A lot of assimilation as well. A real haven for hundreds of years until the Holocaust.
Fast forward to the 1940s.
30s.
And as you point out several times in the book, that the proportion of the perished Jews among Dutch Jews was the highest in Western Europe.
Not only Western, North, South, Central, and West.
Yeah,
So
but
that's
with the exception of Eastern Europe.
of Eastern Europe and quite close to it in proportion.
So we're talking about like 75%?
75% would be the accurate amount. And this is called the Dutch paradox, because we think about the Dutch even these days with such a positive image, with the Anne Frank story and so many righteous of the nations, Dutch people who saved Jews. We've got a very, very positive view of the Dutch till today. And then that collides with this unbelievable proportion of annihilation. And when you go into that and you discover how that could have happened, it is very obvious that the Dutch were part of this, percentage. They collaborated. They sometimes hid Jews in their attic and sometimes gave them away. The Dutch queen and her government fled the Netherlands the minute the Germans came, and the vacuum in the Netherlands, which was way bigger than in France and Belgium, for example. There was nothing. So the Germans could just take over everything, take the papers, take the police, take the trains, and just do everything very efficiently. There was no barrier. So I'm just giving you a few points here to show the Dutch paradox, and I'm in the book, I all the time refer to that paradox, how the films deal with that.
Exactly. So how is this paradox reflected in the films?
Well, you might say that until the late 70s, most films in the Netherlands, even from the silent era, present the Dutch, the positive side of the Dutch saving the Jews, the Dutch helping the Jews. I'm talking about the non-Jewish Dutch people, mainly Christians, Protestants, helping, supporting the Jews, fighting for the Jews, sacrificing themselves for the Jews. And then in the late 70s, as information comes in, a bit more relevant information. This is, by the way, something that happens in most countries like France as well. Suddenly, the statistics show that there was a lot of collaboration, that some, Dutch people collaborated with the Germans. Then the statistic that 30,000 Dutch people volunteered in the Waffen-SS, which is the highest percentage and quantity in all of Europe. All these statistics come in and suddenly, the films start showing collaboration. So you've got, for example, a group of Dutch students. One saves Jews, the other one collaborates with the Germans. One volunteers and fights on the Eastern Front with the Germans. Just a reminder, the Dutch people usually speak German, fluent. The German Nazis considered the Dutch more Aryan than the Germans themselves. And they were actually one of the only nations, if not the only one, that was actually also allowed into the SS. So the Dutch were considered very naturally a German ally. And you've got the NSB, which is a National Socialist Dutch party, taking over in the Netherlands. So it's... and the NSB, this fascist Dutch paramilitary group, is more and more presented in films from the late 70s, 80s, 90s, even in Netflix these days. It's already known that you've got these Dutch people wearing black uniforms, rounding up Jews, executing Jews, ripping off Jews, taking their property. It's already something that is in the visual psyche of the Dutch.
And to you, as a scholar dealing with issues like national identity and stereotypes and the story nations tell themselves, what can you tell about this progression of the way the Dutch see their role in the destruction of the Jewish community?
Well, I'll separate it into two parts. First of all, talking about national identity, what I discovered watching these films is that if in the first half of the 20th century and the first decades after the Second World War, the Jew is usually presented as an outsider, as an other, sometimes even as an evil other, weird, a weird person that dresses differently and behaves differently than, most people. Gradually, in the 21st century, we see the Jew becoming the Dutchman himself. He is an other, he still is an other, who is much more similar to the Dutch. With the background of immigration from the 70s, 80s, 90s, from Suriname and Muslim countries and North African countries into Amsterdam, into the Netherlands, they suddenly look in nostalgia at the Jews that have disappeared, and they say, wait, they were white, they were mainly secular, they were liberal, they were actually quite similar to us. So now the Jew, in this very weird metamorphosis, becomes the Dutchman, the stereotype or the prototype of the Dutchman. They're even sometimes blonde Jews. Amazing. They sometimes even have blue eyes. They really look like us. They're never tall like us. Just a little joke. But they look like us. And then in another flip, this antagonism starts towards the Jews because, this general antagonism you have now in Western Europe towards colonialism and extra tolerance towards immigrants. So, okay, the Jews are like us, so they're the colonialists. Whether they're Israelis or Jews, it doesn't matter. They're like us, the Dutch, and we should criticize them for what they've done. Now you asked about how they deal with the Holocaust. What is their part in it? Well, again, if suddenly...
Well, sorry, didn't you see these two questions as connected?
They are connected. You can never, in film history generally, there is before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. There is before World War II and after World War II. Obviously, you cannot start discussing film history at all, in any category, in any genre, in any field of film studies without setting that straight. Of course it's connected. Of course, the Holocaust and World War II is a trigger that shifts the Jew from being an other, an outsider, to someone who is more one of us. That happens all over the world. And of course, it also triggers feelings of guilt in society, which are reflected in the film. We've lost our Jews. Where have the Jews disappeared? Where are the Jewish neighborhoods? One of the films I discuss in my book is a very rare film nobody really has heard of, which the title translates to Yesterday Will Never Come Again. And it starts with shots of the old Jewish neighborhood, the markets, the people in the selling products. This will never be again.
So
I
see it as a way of constructing a national identity, of saying,
course.
Look what we as a collective have done, how much we regret it, and to what extent can we redress this terrible injustice that we ourselves have inflicted.
Well, that's something that only comes about in the 21st century. It took a lot of time to get into that kind of attitude. You don't see much of the guilt. Most of the films in the 60s, 70s, and 80s really strengthen the myth of Dutch heroism. And you've got the Diary of Anne Frank and the films made about Anne Frank that, give you the justification of, look how heroic we were. We saved the Jews, the Germans took them away. In a sense, most Dutch films after Anne Frank are like a version of Anne Frank. The narrative, the script is usually Jews being hidden by non-Jews. In the end, the Germans come and take them away. No happy end, usually. You don't see concentration camps. You don't see extermination camps in Dutch films because it did not happen on their land. That happened somewhere else. So it's always an Anne Frank story. And funnily enough, many of the characters, the Jewish characters in films after Anne Frank, are women. dark-haired women, pale dark-haired women, pale dark-haired women with film posters on their walls, an attic. They're quite, how should I say, feisty? How do you say it? They have an interesting character. They have something artistic about them. They can be painters, writers, something like that. They're secular, usually. They can be resistance fighters, but they still look different, and they care for their own.
They're not as tall as the other
They're
resistance
always
fighters.
short.
Yeah.
Dutch Jews are short. And it has to be said because the Dutch are the tallest nation on earth, according to the Guinness Book of Records. Average height is above 1.80. Good for you.
Yeah.
And,
I always say that I feel very comfortable.
Very comfortable. And by the way, within Dutch society, you've got Friesland, which is the northern district, a very big northern district. And they are the tallest Dutchmen. And actually, they're mentioned by Jonathan Swift in Gulliver as the Frisian giants. So that's really, in that area, by the way, that's where most of the Jews were hidden.
Right.
Jewish children were hidden there. I actually directed 2 episodes in a series about Jewish children hid in Friesland. But again, imagine, like the land of giants and little
Jewish kids.
Little Jewish kids.
No, but I had another question about Anne Frank, but I think you answered it, but maybe you can say other things about it.
Yeah.
The question was, how skewed and top-heavy was the discussion about the Jews by the Anne Frank story because of its huge of fame, that all roads lead back to Anne Frank at the end of the day. Is that the case? To what extent did the Anne Frank story skew the whole discussion of the Holocaust?
Well, it has to be said, if we're accurate in research, we have to say that heroic films came about in the Netherlands even before the Anne Frank story was published. You've got films from 1946-7, before the diary was published, where you see Dutch Protestant farmers and Dutch communists saving Jews. And the Jews are usually passive, they're usually naive, they're usually, it's not very politically correct to say feminine, whether they're men or women.
No, but it does make perfect sense.
They are.
Right?
They're sometimes neurotic, etc., etc. So you've got the Anne Frank type before Anne Frank. Now the Anne Frank diary comes out, and then you've got the George Stevens film in Hollywood, which even amplifies the whole story of how the Dutch were heroic and they saved the Jews, and the nasty Germans took them away, which is not the story. That amplifies. So it's like it goes to Hollywood and then it comes back into Dutch cinema. Because you don't have much Dutch cinema in the 50s and 60s. It comes more in the 70s, the Anne Frank motif of we saved the Jews, the Germans took them. And the Jews were passive and the Jews were naive. And we sometimes cared more about the Jews than the Jews cared for themselves, which is also like a take on Schindler's List.
Is that part of the broader story about the extent of the collaboration of the Dutch people with the Nazis? Because a similar thing happened in France, for example, that up until the 1970s, it was well known that everybody was in the French resistance and nobody was a collaborator. And then slowly but surely, all sorts of critical voices started emerging until the 1990s was the time that, the government fully accepted responsibility for its collaboration with the Nazis. Was that a similar story in the Netherlands?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. It's a different story. Again, in France, you're talking about a proportion of approximately 40% annihilation. In the Netherlands is almost double. So on the one hand, the guilt is stronger, and on the other hand, fighting the guilt is stronger. And I'm telling you, even today, they're not taking full responsibility. It's not possible for them. It's too much. The paradox is too big. The contrast is too big between the Dutch liberal, tolerant stereotype and the absolute Eastern European style annihilation of Jews in the Netherlands. They can't cope with it. It's just too big for them. Full responsibility, they still have a long way to go.
Are the films doing anything to try and counter that atmosphere?
You know, lately in Netflix, the Netherlands is quite strong in Netflix. If I understood correctly, some of the head offices of European Netflix are in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, as opposed to Israel, have a deal with Netflix where some of the profits of Netflix in the country have to go into local productions. This is something, unfortunately, that didn't happen in Israel. Even the Eli Cohen film with Sacha Baron Cohen was filmed in Switzerland. So the Netherlands forced Netflix to make some films in the Netherlands. Now, some of these films recently deal with the Holocaust and Jews. And yeah, what you see there is not only collaboration, but even more complicated collaboration. You've got a film called Riphagen or Riphagen, who, this is a gangster. This is the Dutch Al Capone, who very meticulously goes in the 40s and goes to Jews just before they're being picked up, signs papers with them that the property belongs to him, takes a selfie with them with a contract. This is all legal, and just takes their properties and makes millions out of it and escapes to Argentina, like the classic Nazi ending. And this is already like, this is not only showing collaboration out of force. Okay, I had no option. I would either hide Jews or collaborate with the Nazis. No, this is a real plan. This is a Dutch guy who is really, really nasty, trying to make money out of Jews, not only killing them. And this is something you did not have before. So, yes. Another film is called Suskind, a Jewish guy who for years had this bad name of collaborating with the Nazis, but in fact, it turns out he used his good connection with the Nazis to save many Jewish children. So now you've got more complicated films that really try to show a more balanced view of what happened. The same happens with every historic event.
Does it really trickle up to the public discourse? You said that there's still some resistance to coming to terms with the responsibility of the Dutch. Do those films scratch the surface in any way?
It has to be said, first of all, that except for Korea and maybe Bollywood, there is no nation on earth, including France and Britain, that competes with Hollywood films yet. So you have to check how many Dutch people watch Dutch films. And they're not even used to hearing Dutch on the big screen yet, as we Israelis also. I mean, the films that are most popular in Israel are always the Hollywood films, forever. Do they scratch something? Well, documentaries and some films that go on Netflix have a wide audience, and they might scratch something and create a discussion. For example, a documentary that came out this year that deals with the way the Dutch authorities have been keeping all these art and paintings that have been stolen from Jews, and what's going to happen with that. And now there's a social discussion. You know, what are you going to do with all these paintings? Are you going to really take them out and start searching for the family relatives?
About scratching that resistance.
If something is changing, if it scratches, well, not enough. You know, I'm going to say something a bit more dramatic. I give lectures also about the image of the Jew in Middle Eastern countries like Libya, Tunisia, Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. How are Jews portrayed there?
In films?
In films. Because there are films. There have always been films in these countries where there's a Jewish character or a Jewish story. And I'm going to do a very weird comparison now and say the following thing. In those Middle Eastern countries, what usually stands out is that the Jews that lived in those countries before 1948 were excellent Jews. And you see a positive attitude towards them. You see a nostalgia. Look at the Jewish neighbors we had here. What nice people they were. And there is some anti-Semitism there where they were rich and this and that. They loved money, but they were nice. And then 1948 came. And then 1967 came. And everything changed. The old Jew, we miss him. The new Jew is an Israeli. We don't like him. The same thing, in a way, is happening in the Netherlands. And that's specific to the Netherlands, with their tolerance towards intolerance, with the whole immigration problem going on there. And they're looking at it and they're saying, we miss the old Jews. We're nostalgic towards those Jews who were like us, the Dutch. But now the Jews are different. There's not many Jews left in the Netherlands, 20, 30,000, mainly assimilated. But you've got the Israelis, and there's this antagonism towards them. The new Jews, they're not the ones that lived among us. They're not Spinoza.
Yeah.
They're not Anne Frank, who was not Dutch, by the way.
Is there still a great deal of involvement of Jews in the film industry in post-war Netherlands? You said that they were the pioneers of the film industry in the pre-war years. Does it still prevail?
Well, again, in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, the Jews were perhaps the most dominant group in filmmaking, entrepreneurs, exhibitors, producers, directors, and actors. Part of my research was to document all those Jewish people in the film industry who perished in the Holocaust. But my next contribution, I really believe this is a contribution, is that Jewish involvement in the Dutch film industry did not end. Despite the fact that 75% of the Jewish community was annihilated, you still see Jews in the television industry and the film industry. Just recently, approximately a year ago, Franz Weiss, a Jewish auteur in the film industry, who directed at least 20 feature films which are ranked among the most popular and most well-known films ever made in the Netherlands, and not only Jewish films. He made a trilogy about a Jewish family, and he made a film called about Charlotte Solomon, the artist, which is like an Anne Frank. But he made also like gangster films and comedies. And he was, Franz Weiss, from German descent, Jewish. His son, Geza Weiss, is an actor. You've got many Dutch Jews playing and being actors, being directors, being producers. We've always had this romance with it. It's not only Hollywood. It's just this open area like high-tech and startup where we're always attracted to places where it's not closed for us yet.
But do you see a link between the this structural situation that you describe of some Jews still involved in the industry and the way the content is produced, or the way the images are being constructed?
I'm not sure that's the question, but there's a problem here. If the purpose of filmmaking in the end is profit, then you see in Hollywood and in the Netherlands and everywhere else, Jewish people trying to take a distance from Jewish topics and from Jewish stories, not to be associated with some tribalism. On the other hand, when in my research I checked the premiere dates of many of the films, you see that it's very carefully constructed around Rosh Hashanah sometimes, or some Jewish holidays, or they take into account not to screen it on Shabbat. It's like you see these nuances that sometimes they would do like a special screening for the Jewish community of this film, which is interesting. Like if you check the premiere dates or when the film comes out or special screenings, you do see like it's called a double coding in film research. There's the film for the general audience, but there's the film for a specific audience. And even in the film, you sometimes have double codes. Not everybody in the film, like you watch a Woody Allen film or an Adam Sandler film or a Ben Stiller film, you will have some tiny jokes just for you, perhaps, that
like
you would understand.
Dog whistles. Yeah.
Maybe even a Yiddish word that sometimes comes up. And the Dutch do that as well, especially if there's a Dutch Jewish director or producer involved, definitely, or actor. Yeah.
You were talking about the changing image of the bad Jew. From the anti-Semitic stereotypes of the early 20th century to, the Jew being presented as the evil Westerner and colonialist with connection to Israel. Is the question of Israel-Palestine addressed directly in in Dutch cinema?
Not very often. There's a Jewish filmmaker who made a film called Jesus is a Palestinian in the 70s, just to give you, even the Jewish filmmakers in the Netherlands sometimes relate to, make it complicated. But look, Israel is not mentioned that often in Dutch cinema, but let's look at a film that was made in the last 20 years. A film where Geza Weiss, the Jewish actor, plays a Jewish boy who looks very Moroccan, but he has like he has marks on his body that show that he's Jewish, like a Magen David on his neck, like a Star of David on his neck. When he sits at the table, for example, this film is called in Dutch Alleen maar nette mensen, which means only decent people. Which is interesting, because this Jewish boy, this is 21st century Jewish boy from Amsterdam, doesn't like the decent attitude of his Jewish parents. He doesn't like the Jewish mentality in Amsterdam. And he sometimes says, we need to be more like Israelis. We need to be more tough. We're
prouder.
Not prouder. We're so passive. We're so, we let people push us around. That's just an example where Israel comes up. But that's from the Jewish point of view. In other films, Israel would be, subconsciously criticized as a place that is colonialist. But it's not mentioned that often, I have to say, which is a thing in itself. Why isn't it mentioned? Zionism
because it would
much.
fit very well with your theory, right? That it's
Jews in general are shown as colonialists. This same kid, this same actor, Geza Weiss, in this film called Only Decent People from the 21st century, what he does it's a comedy, and most of the film, what he does, he's trying to get Surinamese women into his bed, because that's his fantasy. So isn't that like the classic colonial white guy enslaving the Africans, the Dutch Africans, the Surinamese, some of the slave owners, the last slave owners were Dutch Jewish slave owners. So you've got this little game. It's not even subtle.
Yeah.
He's a colonialist, and that's all he tries to do. Okay. So it's like, this is us, the Dutch. This is what we've become. The Jews are like us. They were slave owners. They're white. They are machoistic, and they're racist, and they're using people. To go from there to Israel is not and this guy is all the time praising Israel. So if you make the connection, what is Israel an inspiration for what he's doing?
You don't see it as ironic in any way. Because I would think that I haven't watched the film, obviously, but I would think that it could reflect in a way the growing ambivalence of Dutch Jews towards Israel. On the one hand, this attachment; on the other hand, the realization that being too closely associated with it might get them in trouble.
Definitely. First of all, I have to say this film I just mentioned was very successful. Had more than 1 million viewers in the cinema. That's quite a big success. So, it's a comedy. It's like in Israel, the most successful films are not the art films, but Eskimo Limon and all those films
like
that are like
comedies.
This is the kind of Dutch Eskimo Limon. So, Anyway, this ambivalence. Well, Dutch film directors and Dutch authors have always had this ambivalent attitude towards Judaism. On the one hand, to be part of the Jewish community. On the other one, we're Dutch. Okay, we're secular. Always this ambivalence. And you see that also in the films. Even Franz Weiss, the Jewish director, has this ambivalence. And when he's interviewed in newspapers, he always says, it's not a film for Jews. It's a universal thing. It's about love. It's about war. It's not about Jews. It's universal. And yet, if you go into the details, of course, the Holocaust is there, and the Jewish wedding, the ceremonies of the Jewish weddings are there. So there's always an ambivalence. I think it came from literature into theater and then into Dutch filmmaking. This ambivalence, we are part of the community, we're not part of the community.
But that's the ambivalence towards the
Judaism.
Is there any residues with relation to Israel?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
But
even the Jews themselves, even in my family, some people distinguish between Israel and the Jewish people.
But do you see that in cultural representations in the Netherlands, whether it's film
not
or
in
other?
not in film, but I think you see it a lot in journalism and on the internet. This how they distinguish between the good Jews that live among us, and Jews take part sometimes in that ambivalence. We criticize Israel. Look at us, we're criticizing Israel like you do. Recently, the story with Nadav Lapid, the Israeli director who lives in France, and suddenly the French, some French directors and some other directors asking him to leave the festival, and his reaction is, but, I've criticized Israel as well. It's not ambivalence, it's a paradox. Many Dutch Jews criticize Israeli politics, criticize what's happening in Israel, define Israel as colonialist, and it doesn't help them at all. Because Jews recently, and this has to be said in this interview, including my family, I've got a lot of family in Holland, they've taken off their mezuzah from the house. They do not they asked the local Jewish newspapers not to put an envelope, like to hide the newspaper in an envelope and then put it in their post instead of putting the newspaper so that they're designated as Jews. It's a very big paradox.
Yeah, but you're saying that it's not reflected in cinema.
Not that
yet.
not enough. No, Israel is not.
Well, it's still a new phenomenon, so it might take time until it's.
When you research films, you don't only research what is shown, you can also relate to what is not shown. So this is a very interesting point. Why isn't Israel featured in Dutch films? It's a sort of a thing they want to... you might say it's like in the 60s and 70s when collaboration was taken out. We don't want to talk about that side.
Yeah, it's
Israel
taboo.
is out. It's taboo. Yeah. It's we don't want to go there.
Right.
It's not part of the story we want to tell. We want to tell stories about the Jews that lived among us. There were harsh times. There were very hard times for Jews, but there were very good Dutch Christians who helped them. There were some nasty Dutch people who collaborated. That's the main theme. Israel, that's a new story. Those are different kind of Jews. It's a different kind. It's not part of us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Eyal Boers, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And many thanks to Itai Shalom, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. And we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has way more than 1,000 interviews by now, including one with Eyal Boers from about 10 years ago. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and now on Blue Sky as well. But most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.